Tonight on Ukraine Today, Zelenskyy meets Trump in The Hague, from tense expectations to cautious takeaways. New Ukrainian weapons, homegrown guided aerial bombs are ready. The front lines, Ukrainian forces stopped the Russian advance in the Sumy region. The situation is now under control. Mined borders, a forced move by NATO countries neighboring Russia. Special Tribunal for Russia, Ukraine and the Council of Europe are joining forces to prosecute the crime of aggression. All that and more in this episode of Ukraine Today. Hello and welcome from Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Robchun. Like, subscribe, and let's go. Yes, we'll talk about the Zelenskyy-Trump meeting, but just a little later. This is YouTube, so of course, feel free to skip ahead, but there's already a lot of important stuff happening right now. Let's start here. Ukrainian forces have stopped Russian troops from advancing in the Sumy region. The front line is now stable. That's according to the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Oleksandr Syrskyi. Meanwhile, Defense Express reports that Ukraine has created its own guided aerial bombs. These bombs can reach targets up to 60 kilometers away. Now, funding is urgently needed to scale up production. In the past 24 hours, Russia has lost at least 1,100 troops killed and wounded. Since the full-scale invasion began, that's 1,015,750 Russian soldiers. And over the past day alone, Ukraine's defense forces destroyed 1 Russian tank, 7 armored vehicles, 48 artillery systems, plus dozens of other pieces of enemy military equipment. Ukraine's Air Force has also released video of a MiG-29 pilot taking down a Russian attack drone at night. The drone was hit with an air-to-air missile. The pilot, call sign Danfix, now has over 20 confirmed air kills. In The Hague, during the NATO summit, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy met with the US President Donald Trump. Their conversation lasted about 50 minutes.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Zelenskyy described the meeting as meaningful. The two discussed Ukraine's possible purchase of American air defense systems, with Ukraine ready to support US defense manufacturers. Europe could help with funding. They also talk about joint drone production. President Zelenskyy presented evidence that Russia has been returning bodies of dead Russian occupiers, disguised as fallen Ukrainian soldiers. And he showed battlefield maps, proving that Russian military gains are being widely exaggerated by propaganda. He thanked Trump and the United States and congratulated him on a successful US operation in the Middle East. And here's what Donald Trump had to say about the meeting with Zelenskyy.
What I took from the meeting couldn't have been nicer, actually, but I took from the meeting that he'd like to see it end. I think it's a great time to end it. I'm going to speak to Vladimir Putin, see if we can get it ended. But look, these are brave people. They're fighting these wars all over the place. You know, last week they had, I guess, close to 7,000 young soldiers, Russian and Ukrainian soldiers were killed, 7,000 in 1 week. It's crazy. It's crazy. So I'll be speaking to Putin. No, I had a good meeting with Zelenskyy, and I had a lot of good meetings. We had a lot of good meetings with a lot of people, a lot of great leaders. But he's fighting a brave battle. It's a tough battle.
A journalist from Austrian national TV reminded Trump of his promise to end the Russian war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Trump replied that was sarcasm. And then he explained why he still hasn't ended the war.
Because it's more difficult than people would have any idea. Vladimir Putin has been more difficult. Frankly, I had some problems with Zelenskyy. You may have read about him. And it's been more difficult than other wars.
Meanwhile, NATO countries bordering Russia are making a drastic move, going to mine their shared borders with the terrorist state. More in the report.
A new Iron Curtain is descending over Europe. If at the height of the Cold War between NATO and the USSR, it was the Soviet Union that actively built such a barrier on its borders, then in 2025 it is the member countries of the North Atlantic Alliance themselves who are forced to take on this task.
All NATO countries bordering Russia or Belarus have come to the conclusion that in order to deter a possible offensive, measures are needed that until recently were considered unacceptable.
As a result, 4 NATO countries have announced their intention to withdraw from the Ottawa Convention, the treaty banning the production, stockpiling and use of anti-personnel mines. Finland, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia have concluded that in order to deter a possible offensive, measures are needed that until recently were considered unacceptable.
Russia is not a party to the convention and continues to use mines aggressively, putting us at a strategic disadvantage. In such a situation, our armed forces need the freedom to use all possible means to protect people and the eastern flank of NATO.
It is expected that by the end of this month, Finland, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia will officially notify the UN of their withdrawal from the treaty, after which they will begin actively producing, stockpiling and deploying anti-personnel mines in their territories. The Finns will be the first to take action since their border with Russia is the longest among the allied countries.
The Finns are withdrawing from the convention that bans anti-personnel mines. They're going to mine everything over there. Well, apparently based on the Ukrainian experience, yes, where really dense mining was able to stop those small groups of meat grinder assaults, right? Mines work perfectly. Apparently, Finland will now do the same along its entire border with the Russian Federation.
Meanwhile, in Latvia, which has also withdrawn from the Ottawa Convention, they are in no hurry to mind their borders. The authorities are confident that, if necessary, they will do this in the shortest possible time, but for now they are installing anti-tank hedgehogs along the border, digging trenches and actively fortifying the border area with so-called dragon's teeth.
Right now, we are not planning to deploy mines. This concerns the anti-tank and anti-personnel mines we already have. Of course, we need these mines, they are stored in our warehouses. If it comes to an impending crisis and the real military threats, additional measures will be taken at the border, including the deployment of mines. In peacetime, mines will not be deployed.
But the situation can change at any moment, acknowledge the countries that are members of the North Atlantic Alliance. While the Lithuanians, for example, are still confident that they are living in peacetime, their Latvian neighbors, on the contrary, believe that the war against Russia has already begun.
If you look at the map of all hybrid attacks, from cyber attacks and border provocations to ongoing information campaigns, it becomes clear that the level of hostility from Russia toward Lithuania and the region is unprecedented. Russia may be ready to invade NATO territory within 3 to 5 years, roughly between 2028 and 2030.
However, the dates given are very tentative. The Kremlin has long since stopped relying on either logic or common sense in its decisions. Russian troops along the border are actively re-equipping their military bases and moving more and more military equipment to the NATO borders. And this is happening even though they are critically short of those very same tanks on the front in Ukraine.
If a Russian soldier's foot has ever set down somewhere, then Russia believes it has some rights to that territory. But now he's just openly gone too far. Yes, he's not even trying to hide it anymore. He doesn't talk about NES. They call him a legalist, right? About any kind of legal grounds. But really, everyone knows that according to their own rules, this is ours, be their logic. This is ours. Since there was a Russian presence there, it means it's ours.
And it seems that only Ukraine can stop Putin in his ever-expanding territorial ambitions. Experts and analysts agree, if official Kyiv does not hold out, Finland, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia will be next. That is why, alongside strengthening their own borders, the Baltic countries are actively supplying weapons and ammunition to the Ukrainian armed forces, who are now, in fact, defending not only their own land from the occupiers but also NATO countries.
Everything is being decided right now in Ukraine. If the conflict is frozen on terms favorable to the Kremlin, it will be a clear signal to Putin that such barbarism can continue. And then the question arises as to where he might continue doing the same thing. right? So the first thing that comes to mind is the Baltic countries. And plus, from time to time, there are talks about Kazakhstan.
Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling the truth about Russia's war. Click the link in the description to become our sponsor. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It really helps. Ukraine and the Council of Europe have signed an agreement to launch the Special Tribunal for the crime of aggression committed by Russia. The tribunal will allow investigations targeting Russia's top leadership, even those protected by diplomatic immunity. However, sentences can only be handed down after these war criminals lose their official positions.
Justice takes time, but it must happen, I'm sure. And today's agreement and this tribunal give us a real chance to bring justice for the crime of aggression. Other institutions, even international ones, don't have the tools to do this. And we need to show clearly aggression leads to punishment. And we must make it happen together across all of Europe. Slava Ukraini!
And finally, the Kremlin is expanding its military presence in Africa. Russia is supplying its forces there with tanks, armored vehicles, electronic warfare systems, and more. Why? What's the strategy behind this? The answers coming up.
The Kremlin is once again stepping onto the international stage. But not with diplomacy, with weapons. Russia is increasing its military presence in Africa. They are transferring equipment, their howitzers, armored vehicles, and even electronic warfare systems.
Why the African core, that is Russia, that is the Kremlin, is strengthening its position in Africa, that's clear.
Russia wants to push Western countries out of there.
First and foremost, of course, this concerns France, because Russia's main interest today is in those countries that were once French colonies. There used to be a fairly significant political and in some places even military presence of France.
Officially, all of this is organized under the name African Corps. It is being created on the basis of former Wagner fighters and Ministry of Defense military personnel.
If Wagner was still a Russian proxy, now these are state structures. And Russia can no longer pretend or claim it wasn't me and the horse isn't mine and all that.
The goal is not just to protect the Kremlin's interests in the region, but to actively promote them.
As long as Russia is on the Security Council, it can always veto any Security Council decision against some cannibalistic regime. And accordingly, in exchange, it buys the votes of African countries during voting at the UN General Assembly. That is such a change, well, you could say political.
But who can actually join this African Corps?
Well, right now there's a full-scale recruitment going on. They're recruiting everyone on various social networks for all sorts of military specialties, from, I don't know, drone operators to, say, tank crew members. And currently there's active recruitment for the African Corps itself. Maybe some people think that fighting there is less dangerous than fighting in Ukraine and that the pay will be good. Of course, there are also all sorts of infections there. What if you get bitten by a tsetse fly?
The most important thing during selection is health. Although you can get by without it too.
Health is an important aspect since the guys are carrying out missions in the hot climate of the African continent. But we still consider people, even if they have some health limitations.
According to the Associated Press, Moscow is sending various equipment to the African Corps using cargo ships. But in what quantities?
Of course, it could be a significant amount because the situation in these countries is unstable. There are constantly conflicts flaring up, both with neighbors and within the country. So naturally, everything has to be suppressed by military force. That's why the volumes there are likely to be quite substantial. On top of that, Russia wants to expand its influence to other countries as well. And to do that, it needs to seize more and more new ones.
The main areas of focus are the Central African Republic, Mali and Burkina Faso. In these countries, Russia has long been operating through private military companies and soft power tools.
They say that countries like France, America, and the United Kingdom are bad because they colonized everyone, while we are good, pure, and innocent. But in reality, if you look at what actually happens, it turns out to be the same as always, just like in all the wars Russia has fought, the destruction of civilians, torture, and absolute atrocities across the board.
At the same time, we shouldn't forget that the war with Ukraine is still ongoing, as is the pressure from sanctions. Russia is spending billions on the front lines while simultaneously getting involved in a new region.
Investing, of course, is profitable. Because first of all, they gain access to natural resources, right? Because the first countries Wagner entered, primarily the Central African Republic, it was mainly about gaining access to natural resources. And the concessions they received, they didn't always get government funding for them, right? So the initial funding was from the government, and then they started making money from selling those very natural resources.
But does this pose any risks to other countries from the African core?
The risk is enormous. And the risk lies in this. Everything Russia is doing today, whether it's the presence of the African core in Africa or the war in Ukraine, is an attempt to undermine the modern Western model of civilization, an attempt to destroy the idea that human rights should be the main priority in politics.
Africa is turning into yet another arena where Russia seeks to cement its influence through the supply of equipment, support for regimes, and military presence under a new flag.
That's all for today. Thank you for being with us. We read your comments and we feel your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and see you next time.